In Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 7, the woman concludes her celebration of the man's love for her with a warning to her companions. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Interestingly enough, she repeats these exact same words in chapter 3, verse 5. But what is she talking about here? Why is she advising these other young women to not awaken love until it pleases? And what would that even mean? Some interpreters have suggested that what's happened here is that the man has fallen asleep, and the woman is asking her friends not to wake up her lover and let him sleep. That's exactly how the translators of the King James Version interpret these words. You can see it in their translation. I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye not stir up nor awake my love until he pleases. Unfortunately, that doesn't really make good sense of the Hebrew grammar of this verse, because in the Hebrew, it's very clear that the subject of the verb please is feminine, not masculine. So it can't be a reference to the man sleeping. The woman isn't requesting that her lover be allowed to sleep until he pleases. She's warning her friends against awakening love itself too quickly. And within the context of this poem, it's very clear that when she speaks about love, she's not just talking about romance. As one commenter observes, the woman is not just talking about love in this verse, she's talking about sex. She is telling us once again that true love waits. This may not have been a very countercultural thing to say in her time. After all, whether or not she's been personally successful in maintaining her own chastity, her society certainly expected women to remain virgins until they were married. But as conventional as her advice may have been in her own time, it is certainly countercultural today. Today, it's very common for couples to become intimate with one another very early in their relationships. Within popular discussions of dating, you'll often hear references to what people call the 3-date rule. No one knows exactly where it came from. Some people say it originated with the TV show Sex and the City. Others say it has been around longer than that. But whatever its origins may be, it reflects a popular mindset, which is the expectation that as long as things are going well, your third date with another person is a reasonable time to expect your relationship to become sexually intimate. Of course, not everyone agrees. I recently came across an article in Women's Health entitled Definitive Proof that the 3-date sex rule is total BS. And I thought, oh, okay, here's someone who's going to advocate for more old-fashioned expectations. But then I read the article and I realized that the author wasn't suggesting that people are becoming intimate too soon. Her objection to the 3-date rule was that many people don't want to wait until the third date, and no one should expect them to. Needless to say, her advice wasn't anything like the advice that the woman in the song is giving to her companions. So why does the woman in the song advise her friends to wait? Why does she repeatedly give this exhortation not to awaken love until it pleases? You could say she's just being old-fashioned. In fact, she's being very old-fashioned, like 3,000 years ago old-fashioned. But there's more to it than that. She's not just reflecting her culture's values. She has a reason for saying that true love waits. And we can understand her reason if we pay attention to what she says in between this repeated exhortation, in between chapter 2, verse 7 and chapter 3, verse 5. More specifically, I'd like to suggest that we can understand why she says what she does by paying attention to the possessive language that she repeatedly uses when talking about her lover and their love. Notice how she begins in chapter 2, verse 8. The voice of my beloved. Behold, he comes leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills. The imagery of mountains and hills may be unfamiliar, but the sentiment here is clear enough. She is clearly separated from him, and she sees him, and he's coming toward her, and her heart leaps for joy. And he comes to her home, and even when he can't be in the same room with her, he speaks to her. Behold, she says, there he stands behind our wall, gazing through the windows, looking through the lattice. She may almost sound like she's describing a stalker, but that's not what she has in mind. Don't think of some creepy stalker. Think of Romeo, standing under the window of the Capulet home, speaking words of love and desire to Juliet. Because that's exactly what the man does. He tells her of his love and his longing to be with her. He compares their love to springtime and invites her to come away and celebrate it with him. It's a beautiful image of two people completely enthralled with one another, both longing for the day when they can be fully together. But the springtime imagery, that's not really what I want to focus on. Instead, I want you to pay attention to the language that they use when they speak about each other. In verse 8, the woman begins with a very possessive way of speaking. My beloved. That's what she calls him. In fact, it's what she continues to call him every time she refers to him in verse 9, verse 10, and then when she speaks again in verse 16. And the man does the same thing. How does he address her when he speaks to her? Arise, my love, my beautiful one. My love, my beautiful one. That may not seem very consequential at first, but after a while, all this mine is hard to miss. The love that these two lovers share seems very possessive of one another. You can see it in the woman's dream, which she relays in the first 4 verses of chapter 3. She's on her bed and she has a dream that her beloved is gone and she doesn't know where he is, and she's frantically looking for him. She's running through the darkened streets of the city and asking the night watchmen if they've seen him anywhere. And then finally she finds him, and she brings him back with her to the safety of her mother's home, determined not to let him go again. The language, the longing, the anxiety of separation, all of it conveys a sense of ownership that these lovers feel toward one another. All of it reinforces the feelings that the woman very clearly articulates in verse 16. My beloved is mine, and I am his. It's a sentiment that she'll later repeat almost verbatim in chapter 6 when she says, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. But what, you might ask, does any of this have to do with her admonition to her friends to put off sexual intimacy, to wait until marriage, not to awaken love until it pleases? Well, think about how the Bible talks about marriage and sex. Think about its first words in the subject. In Genesis chapter 2, after God creates Eve and Adam sees her and rejoices in her and calls her bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, what does Genesis say? Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. To speak of two people becoming one flesh is, on the one hand, it's a way of describing them as family, because that is what sex and that is what marriage is intended for, to create a new family, a permanent bond that unites people together. A bond so close that everything that belongs to one now belongs to the other. It's how Adam sees Eve when he calls her flesh of his flesh. It's how the woman feels about the man when she says, my beloved is mine and I am his. What she wants, what she's longing for, is not simply to feel his caresses, but to be made one flesh with him, to belong to him, and for him to belong to her. And this is precisely why not only this woman, but the rest of the Bible warns us so frequently about sexual intimacy outside of marriage. Because as Jesus says, God's intention with sex is to bind a man and woman together as one flesh, to bind them permanently and irrevocably in a way that no one should separate. That's why the Apostle Paul tells early Christians in Corinth that they shouldn't engage in any kind of activity with prostitutes. Not just because prostitution exploits women, although Paul would certainly be concerned with that, but because there is something sacred about sex and the bond it creates. Do you not know, Paul says, that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For, as it is written, the two shall become one flesh. The woman in this song, she knows that. She knows what kind of union it is that she's longing for with this man. She expresses how this love feels. My beloved is mine. I am his. And that's exactly why she tells her friends to wait. Because she knows that that kind of union is anything but casual. And she knows the danger and the harm that can come from becoming one flesh with someone to whom you're not yet bound. This woman has a lot of wisdom when it comes to love and relationships. She undoubtedly would have a great deal to say to a culture like the one in which we live today, where so many people, including even Christians, often see no real reason to wait or postpone for intimacy. But what about our spiritual lives? What does the possessive love of this woman and this man for one another, what does it teach us about our relationship with God? The Apostle Paul himself draws a spiritual lesson from the one flesh union that a man and woman experience when they're bound together. In Ephesians chapter 5, he's talking about a husband's love for his wife, and he says, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church." You're probably familiar with those verses, but even if you are, don't skip over them too quickly. Because what Paul is saying here is incredibly profound. It isn't just that the relationship between Christ and the church is like a marriage. No, what Paul is saying is that you who have been united to Jesus by faith, you who are a part of his church, he is saying that you have actually become one flesh with Christ, that you belong to him and he belongs to you, that Jesus nourishes and cherishes you just as he would his own body. Do you hear how tenderly the man speaks to the woman? "Arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away." Those words reflect the same tender love that Christ feels for his people. And do you remember what Jesus himself says about the permanency of this kind of relationship? When he quotes that same verse from Genesis about the two becoming one flesh, and then he says to the Pharisees, "What therefore God hath joined together, let no one put asunder." We tend to read these words with reference to what Jesus teaches about marriage and divorce, and we're right to do so. But for Christians, these words are also a source of incredible comfort. Because what Jesus is talking about here, becoming one flesh, Paul says that applies to Christ and the church. So, unlike a dating relationship, which can come and go depending on how two people feel about one another, which doesn't have any kind of real commitment, our relationship with Jesus is stable and permanent. No one can separate it. No one can put asunder. Those who belong to Jesus, they're not just loved by him. They have been bound to him by God. And it is a bond that no one can break. Finally, I think that this section of the song, I think it could teach us something about the fidelity that we owe to Christ. When this woman says that her beloved is hers and she is his, she's not just saying that they belong to one another. She's also saying they don't belong to anyone else. Infidelity often plays a role in our own experiences of love, or we've certainly at least seen it. But it was never what God intended for marriage. Nor is it what he intends for his relationship with his people, which is exactly why God gives such strict prohibitions of idolatry. It's the first command he gives to Moses. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other God before me. Of course, the people of Israel fail to uphold this command. They end up devoting themselves to other gods. And when the Lord sends prophets to rebuke them for this idolatry, how does he describe it? As a husband who has been betrayed by an unfaithful wife. I loved you. I adored you. I bound myself to you, God says to his people through the prophet Ezekiel. But you trusted in your beauty and were unfaithful because of your renown and lavished your unfaithfulness on any passerby. Your beauty became his. Idolatry isn't just sin, it's adultery. It's betrayal. It's a woman saying to her husband, I'm yours and you're mine, but that's not enough. Interpreters of the Song of Songs, they've often noted how idealized the relationship between this man and this woman is. Yes, they face obstacles in their love. Yes, they're sometimes separated, like in her dream. And yes, they have to wait for their love's consummation. But at the end of the day, their relationship seems almost perfect. Too perfect, too pure for us to be able to relate to. Because as much as we would like to experience this kind of romance, and as much as we'd like to feel this kind of love and passion and single-minded devotion in our relationship with Jesus, the truth is we are far less chaste and far less faithful than this woman is to her beloved. She zealously guards and protects their love. We, on the other hand, much like the Israelites, often gives ourselves over to other loves, other loyalties, which is why, as we read and study this song, we must never forget what God said to his faithless people through the prophet Jeremiah. They had failed, but he remained faithful. After denouncing their failures and their adultery and proclaiming judgment upon them, Jeremiah spoke a new word from God to them. And you shall be my people, and I will be your God. You may have abandoned me in my love, but I have not abandoned you. Despite your faithlessness, despite your sin, God is saying, I am still committed and I still love you. You will be mine, and I will be yours.